We're diving deep into a story that's going to leave you questioning what really goes on behind closed doors. But before we jump into all the drama, take a second to hit that like button, share this with a friend who might need some good tea, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more juicy stories every week. Alright, let's get into it. This story takes place in 2022, in a small suburban town just outside of Atlanta, Georgia. The kind of place where the streets are tree-lined, the neighbors wave as you drive by, and the air smells like fresh grass after summer rain. On the surface, everything looks perfect, but as we know all too well, looks can be deceiving. Our main character here is Brian Mitchell, a 35-year-old software engineer who's been working for a tech startup for the past 5 years. He's been married to his high school sweetheart, Rachel, for almost a decade. They have 2 kids together, Mia, who's 7, and Noah, who's 5. They've built a life together, the kind of life you see in Instagram photos, with perfect family vacations and home renovations. But behind the social media posts, things haven't been as perfect as they seem. Brian's the type of guy who prides himself on being dependable, hardworking, and, if we're being honest, a bit of a workaholic. He spent years dedicating himself to his career, often putting in long hours, barely taking a break. He's the kind of guy who believes that the key to a happy life is working hard, making money, and doing whatever it takes to support your family. And to be fair, it worked. He was good at his job and made a pretty comfortable living. But here's the thing about working too much. It doesn't leave room for much else. It doesn't leave room for your wife to feel heard or appreciated. It doesn't leave room for your kids to feel like they're your priority. And over time, that's exactly what happened. Brian thought he was doing everything right, but Rachel started to feel neglected. She was lonely. She was exhausted from carrying the emotional weight of the family, managing the kids, and keeping up appearances, all while feeling like she was just a background character in Brian's busy life. She tried to talk to him about it, of course. They'd have these long conversations where she'd express how much she missed their connection, how she felt like she was raising the kids alone, and how his work seemed to always come first. But every time, Brian would promise to do better, to be more present, to make her feel loved. But the promises would always fall short. The more he worked, the more he seemed to be drifting away from her. Rachel, meanwhile, felt stuck. She loved Brian. She really did. But she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pretending that everything was fine when she was drowning in her own unmet needs. And that's when things started to change. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, Rachel came to Brian with a heavy heart. She said she needed to talk, and Brian, who had just gotten home from another late night at the office, tried to listen. She said that she felt like their marriage was no longer what it used to be. She was unhappy, and she didn't know what to do about it. She didn't want to leave, but she didn't want to keep pretending everything was okay either. It was a painful conversation, one that Brian hadn't expected, but one that he couldn't ignore. At first, Brian thought it was just another one of those moments where Rachel was frustrated and needed some reassurance. He promised her again that he would do better. But Rachel, for the first time, didn't give him that hopeful smile and nod. She didn't seem convinced. She told him that she wasn't sure she could keep waiting for things to change. And that's when Brian's heart sank. He had heard the rumors. He had seen the signs. But he never expected it would happen to him. It was a slow burn at first. Rachel started spending more time away from home. She'd meet friends for coffee or go out for girls' night, something she hadn't done in a while. Brian noticed, but he didn't think much of it. He was too busy with work. Then came the late nights, the long hours, the texts that seemed to be more frequent than usual. And that's when the doubt started creeping in. One night, after a particularly late shift at work, Brian returned home to find Rachel in the living room. She was sitting on the couch, staring at her phone, her face flushed. When he asked if everything was okay, she looked up at him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she said. But Brian could tell something was off. As he walked to the kitchen, he caught a glimpse of her phone screen. It wasn't intentional, he was just passing by. But there it was, a message from a man. Brian's heart skipped a beat. The text was casual, friendly even, but something about the way it made him feel wasn't. He couldn't make out much more than a few words, but the tone was familiar. Too familiar. He stopped in his tracks, the weight of the realization hitting him like a ton of bricks. Something was wrong. He felt sick to his stomach, the kind of sick you get when your gut tells you that the person you love might not be as faithful as you thought. "Rachel," Brian said, his voice steady, but there was a tremble in it that he couldn't hide. She looked up at him again, her face paling slightly. There was a moment of silence, just long enough for Brian to see the guilt in her eyes. "Is there something you want to tell me?" he asked, his words piercing through the air. Rachel's eyes welled up with tears. She opened her mouth to say something but closed it again. Brian could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken truth hanging heavy between them. This wasn't just a fight about late nights or work anymore. This was bigger. This was betrayal. Brian, I didn't mean for it to happen," Rachel finally whispered, her voice breaking. Brian could feel the world shifting around him. The weight of her words settled deep into his chest. "What do you mean?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer. Rachel hesitated, then finally spoke. "I've been seeing someone else. It's not what you think. I never wanted to hurt you. It just happened." The words hit Brian like a wave. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what to feel. All he could do was stand there, in stunned silence, as his heart cracked in ways he didn't know were possible. He had loved her. He had worked so hard to build a life with her, and now it was all slipping through his fingers. And just like that, Brian's whole world changed. So, there Brian stood, his heart heavy with the weight of Rachel's confession. The world around him seemed to blur, like everything was spinning out of control. His mind was racing, questions flooding his thoughts. Who was it? How long had this been going on? Why hadn't he noticed? But at that moment it didn't matter. The damage had already been done. Rachel, the woman he had loved for so long, had just shattered his entire reality with a few simple words. "I've been seeing someone else." "Who is it?" Brian finally managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper, but it hung in the air like an accusation. Rachel's eyes welled up with more tears, and for a brief second, Brian thought she might confess everything. But instead, she looked away, avoiding his gaze. I don't know if I should say," she stammered, clearly fighting with herself. It was a strange mix of guilt and fear, the kind of fear that only comes when you know you've crossed a line that can't easily be undone. Brian was struggling to keep his composure, but the hurt was starting to seep through. He wasn't angry yet. Not completely. But there was an ache deep inside him that he couldn't ignore. He had trusted her. They had built a life together, a family. And now that trust was gone, crumbled in an instant. "Do I know him?" Brian asked, his voice tightening. He could feel the tension building between them, thick and suffocating. Rachel looked up at him, her face pale, and for the first time, she didn't look like the woman he had fallen in love with. I don't want to hurt you more than I already have," she said, choking on her words. "But you deserve to know. It's Mark." Mark. Brian's stomach dropped. Mark had been one of his closest friends. They had met in college and had kept in touch over the years. He had trusted Mark. Hell, they had even shared secrets. And now, Mark was the one who had stolen something that was more valuable than any secret. They had stolen Rachel's love. Brian stood there, speechless. The betrayal cut deeper than anything he could have imagined. Mark wasn't just a friend. He was a part of the life Brian had worked so hard to build. And now that life was crumbling around him. "I never meant for this to happen, Brian," Rachel continued, her voice breaking as she reached for his hand. But Brian pulled back, his emotions swirling inside him. "I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I couldn't keep living like this. I felt like I was invisible to you." Stop," Brian interrupted, shaking his head. His anger was slowly starting to build, but it wasn't directed at her. Not yet. He was angry at himself. Angry at how blind he had been. All those late nights, all those missed moments, all those times he had told himself that work came first. "Don't make this about me," Brian said, his voice cold. "You chose this. You chose to do this behind my back. And you chose Mark. Mark, of all people." Rachel flinched at his words, But Brian couldn't stop the flood of emotions anymore. They had been building up for years, and now they were spilling over. "I know I screwed up," Rachel said, her eyes pleading with him. "But we can fix this. We can work through it. Please, Brian. We don't have to end like this." Brian shook his head again, his mind a mess of anger, hurt, and disbelief. It felt like the whole foundation of his life was slipping through his fingers. How could he go back to a marriage that had been shattered so completely? How could he ever trust her again? "I don't know if I can," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. And for the first time in years, he felt completely lost. As the night dragged on, the tension between them was palpable. Brian couldn't look at Rachel without seeing Mark's face. Could he forgive her? Could he forgive Mark? And what about their kids? Mia and Noah didn't deserve this. They didn't deserve to see their family torn apart like this. Rachel, still crying, begged Brian not to make any rash decisions. She told him she would do anything to fix things, but Brian wasn't sure if he even wanted to. The damage was done. The love that had once felt so certain now felt like a distant memory. The next few days were a blur for Brian. He barely slept, spending most of his time at work, drowning himself in endless tasks that he couldn't focus on. He felt like he was living in a fog. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Rachel and Mark. Every time he tried to talk to Rachel, the words seemed to get caught in his throat. Nothing felt real anymore. But even in the midst of his pain, there was one thing he couldn't ignore: the overwhelming sense of betrayal. And, for the first time, Brian realized that he wasn't just mad at Rachel. He was mad at himself, too. He had let his career consume him. He had neglected his marriage. He had ignored the warning signs. And now he was paying the price. The guilt gnawed at him, making it hard to breathe, making it hard to think straight. During a rare moment of peace, Brian took a long walk to clear his head. He wandered through the park near his house, trying to escape the turmoil in his mind. As he sat on a bench, the cool evening breeze brushing against his face, he thought about the future. What would it look like now? Could he start over? Was there any way to heal from this? The pain wasn't going to disappear overnight. But Brian knew one thing for sure. He couldn't stay in this marriage any longer. He couldn't pretend that everything was okay. And so Brian made a decision. He had to take control of his life. He had to figure out what he wanted and stop being passive in his own story. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but he was done letting fear and guilt hold him back. He had to confront the fallout of his choices, and that meant facing Rachel, facing Mark, and, most importantly, facing himself. As Brian made his way back home, a part of him felt lighter. The decision wasn't easy, but it was the right one. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he was determined to rebuild. Before we move on, I want to remind you to share, comment, and subscribe if you're enjoying this story. Your support means the world, and it helps us keep these incredible stories coming. So, Brian's journey was just beginning. He had taken the first step towards figuring out what he really wanted in life. But was he ready to face what was coming next? Would he be able to rebuild his trust in others? Or would he let this betrayal define him forever? Stick around, because things are about to get even more complicated. So here we are. Brian is standing on the edge of a massive decision. After all that's happened, the hurt, the betrayal, the quiet acceptance that his marriage to Rachel was a shadow of what it used to be, he finally decides it's time for a change. The tension between him and Rachel had been escalating since that night when she confessed about Mark. It was clear that their marriage was unraveling fast. But no matter how much Brian tried to focus on work or push through the pain, it was there, like an unshakable weight that never lifted. But just as things seemed to be heading into a freefall, Brian began to do something different. Instead of focusing on the anger and sadness, he took action. His first step was moving out of the house, taking a small apartment just a few miles away from the kids, where he could start over. It wasn't much, but it was his space, free from the constant reminders of the life he had lost. The emotional cost of that move was enormous, but Brian knew it had to happen. He had to detach to regain control over his own life, or he'd lose himself completely. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and meetings with divorce lawyers. He hated it all. The process of untangling everything, figuring out custody arrangements, and splitting assets was brutal. But even amid the chaos, there were moments of clarity. When he was alone at night, sitting in his new apartment, he realized something. The worst thing about Rachel's betrayal wasn't the affair itself. It was the fact that, despite everything, he had still tried to hold onto the marriage for the sake of what they had built. It wasn't just the cheating. It was how Rachel had made him feel like he was the one who wasn't enough. And that was the hardest part. But it wasn't over yet. The next bombshell came when Brian found out that Mark wasn't just an affair partner. He was planning to fight for full custody of the kids. Brian was blindsided. Of all the things to do, this was the worst. Mark, the man who had destroyed everything Brian had built, now wanted to take his children from him? It felt like a cruel, twisted joke. Brian's reaction was visceral. He couldn't just sit back and let this happen. He couldn't let Mark waltz in, playing the hero, taking everything that belonged to Brian, including his relationship with his kids. This was the breaking point, the moment when Brian realized that he needed to fight back. But how? How do you go up against a man who has already taken so much from you? How do you face someone who once called himself your friend? Brian wasn't sure at first. He didn't know where to start. But as the days went by, a plan began to form in his mind. He couldn't fight this battle with anger or desperation. He needed to be smart. He needed leverage. That's when he decided to confront Mark. It wasn't going to be a calm, rational discussion. It wasn't going to be a let's talk this out kind of meeting. No, Brian was done with words. He had been betrayed enough. The emotional pain of Rachel's affair, the sheer gall of Mark's actions, all of it had finally pushed Brian over the edge. It was time to do something that would send a message. The meeting was set up in a neutral location. Brian told Mark to meet him at a small coffee shop on the edge of town. Somewhere public, but still private enough to have a conversation without too many interruptions. When Mark walked in, Brian didn't give him the satisfaction of a polite greeting. He wasn't here to play nice anymore. "Sit down, Mark," Brian said, his voice low but firm. "We need to talk." Mark looked at Brian, clearly not expecting the intensity in his tone. But he sat down anyway, as though he was ready to be the bigger man, the one who had nothing to hide. "You're really going to do this?" Mark asked, his voice calm but with an edge of arrogance. "You're going to try to turn everything around on me now?" Brian leaned in, locking eyes with him. "You took my wife. You took my family. You think you can just stroll in here and take my kids, too?" Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Brian could see the hesitation in his eyes, the realization that this was no longer the calm, quiet conversation he'd been expecting. Brian wasn't done. "You think I won't fight you for them?" Brian continued. "I'll do whatever it takes, Mark. You've made your move. Now I'm making mine." For the first time, Mark looked nervous. His confident posture started to falter as Brian's words began to sink in. Brian could tell that the idea of an all-out war over custody hadn't fully hit Mark until now. "I didn't want to do this, Brian," Mark said, his voice wavering slightly. "I never meant for things to get this far. Rachel and I—" Brian cut him off, holding up a hand. "I don't care what you and Rachel did. This is about the kids. You don't get to come into their lives and just claim them as your own because you think you deserve something." Mark looked like he wanted to argue, but instead, he just sat there, visibly struggling with his emotions. Brian could see the doubt creeping in, but he didn't care. He wasn't here to negotiate. He wasn't here to reason with Mark. Brian stood up, his heart pounding. "I'll see you in court. You may have Rachel's trust, but you'll never take my kids from me. Never." And with that, Brian walked out of the coffee shop, leaving Mark to sit in silence. The anger inside him wasn't gone. It was still there, simmering. But now it wasn't just a feeling. It was fuel. Brian had a new focus, a new purpose. This wasn't just about Rachel anymore. This was about his family, and he was willing to fight for them. As Brian drove home, the weight of his words still hung in the air. The battle was far from over. The stakes were higher than ever, and Brian knew he had to dig deep. He couldn't afford to be weak now. At that moment, Brian understood something he hadn't before. Sometimes you don't just have to survive. You have to fight. And he was ready to fight for everything that mattered. Brian didn't waste any time after his confrontation with Mark. He knew that the custody battle was just beginning. But now, he was armed with the one thing that had been missing: clarity. For the first time in weeks, Brian felt in control of his own narrative. It wasn't just about saving his marriage anymore. It was about doing what was right for his kids, and doing it on his terms. The decision to fight Mark for custody had never been more real, and the weight of it hit him the next morning. Sitting at his kitchen table with his phone in hand, he stared at the calendar. The legal paperwork was already being processed, and the battle lines were being drawn. His mind raced with questions. What would the court think? How would Rachel respond? Could Mark really take the kids away from him? As if on cue, his phone buzzed. It was Rachel. "Brian, I need to talk to you," the message read. "Please, we need to figure this out." He stared at the text for a long moment, unsure of how to respond. Rachel had made her decision. She had chosen Mark over him. So why was she reaching out now? To pull him back in? To make him feel guilty for doing what he needed to do to protect his family? But Brian had come too far to fall for that. He was past the point of saving a marriage that had been built on lies. Still, his heart felt heavy as he typed a quick reply. "I don't think there's anything left to talk about." He hit send and set the phone down. The pain of it, the emptiness, was something that couldn't be fixed by a simple conversation. He had already lost too much, and there was no going back. But what was going forward going to look like? Brian knew that Mark wasn't going to give up easily. The thought of losing everything, especially his kids, was a fear that gnawed at him daily. But he couldn't let that fear control him. If Mark thought he could just waltz in and take over Brian's life, he had another thing coming. The first legal meeting was set for the following week, and Brian made sure to prepare. He wasn't going to be blindsided again. He'd learned his lesson the hard way when he let Rachel's infidelity slide. Now it was time to make a stand. He reached out to his lawyer, Karen, a tough, no-nonsense woman who had been handling family law cases for over a decade. She knew the score, and she wasn't going to let Mark or anyone else steamroll Brian. "We'll fight this in court," Karen said firmly during their first meeting. "But we need to build a solid case. We'll start with the affair. Rachel's infidelity is going to be key in this battle. You're the better parent, Brian. We'll prove that." Brian nodded, his jaw clenched. He hated that this was even necessary, but he wasn't about to let Mark waltz in and take everything he had worked for. The next few days felt like an endless grind. Brian spent hours poring over legal documents, discussing the case with Karen, and trying to make sense of the emotional roller coaster he was on. But things started to feel different. There was a shift in the air, a change that he couldn't quite put his finger on. Rachel wasn't trying to reach out as much anymore. It was almost as if she had resigned herself to what was happening. Maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to understand that the damage had already been done. But there was still Mark. And that, in Brian's mind, was the real threat. Mark, the man who had torn his family apart, was now trying to waltz into the role of the perfect stepdad. As if he could just erase the past and start fresh with Brian's kids. Brian couldn't stomach the thought. It was a Friday evening when the next big confrontation came. Brian was home alone, a glass of whiskey in hand, watching his favorite show to take his mind off things when his phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. "Hello?" he answered cautiously. "Brian, it's Rachel." The voice on the other end sounded tight, strained. "We need to talk." Brian sighed. "This again." "Rachel, we've talked enough." "No, this is different. Please, just hear me out," she pleaded. Against his better judgment, Brian agreed. He was tired of playing games, but there was still something inside him that couldn't completely shut Rachel out. After everything they had been through, he still had some remnants of hope. They agreed to meet at a local park, a neutral place. Brian didn't want to be alone with her in his apartment, and he didn't want her to feel comfortable in his space. He needed distance, both physically and emotionally. When they met at the park, it was cold. Fall had fully settled in, and the air had that crisp bite to it that made everything feel even heavier. Rachel was standing by the entrance, looking almost fragile, as if the weight of everything had finally caught up with her. Brian didn't make her wait long. As soon as he arrived, she walked toward him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of softness. "Brian," she started, her voice trembling. I just want to explain." Brian held up a hand, stopping her. "No, we're past explaining. We're past apologies." Rachel flinched but didn't back down. I know, but I need you to know I never meant for it to go this far." "Then why did it?" Brian asked, his voice rough. The words had been building inside him for so long, the anger and the hurt bubbling to the surface. "Why did you let it happen? Why didn't you tell me? We could have fixed it, Rachel. But you chose to go behind my back. You chose him." She swallowed hard, her eyes flickering with shame. "I don't know. I felt like you didn't care anymore. I was so alone. And then Mark was there. He listened. He was kind to me when you weren't." "That's the excuse?" Brian said bitterly. "That's the reason you broke up our family?" Rachel took a deep breath, as if gathering her thoughts. But before she could speak, Brian interrupted her. "You don't get to do this," he said, his voice growing stronger with every word. "You don't get to play the victim in all this. You had a choice, Rachel. You had a choice, and you chose to betray me." Tears welled up in Rachel's eyes, but Brian didn't soften. "You've hurt me and you've hurt the kids, and now Mark wants to take them from me. I won't let that happen." Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but Brian turned and started walking away. "I'm done," he said, his back turned to her. "You've made your choice. Now I'm making mine." As Brian walked away from Rachel, a weight lifted off his chest. For the first time in months, he felt like he was taking control. But even as the adrenaline pumped through his veins, he knew that the war wasn't over. The next fight, custody, was just beginning, and it was going to be brutal. But Brian was ready. He had nothing left to lose, and he was prepared to go all the way. The story wasn't over yet, and the next chapter would be his. After that intense conversation with Rachel at the park, Brian's emotions were on fire. Every word she spoke still echoed in his mind, and no matter how hard he tried to push it out, it lingered there. She was still looking for a way back, as if everything could be fixed with a few more apologies. But Brian was done waiting for apologies. He was done trying to fix something that was already broken beyond repair. He spent the next few days preparing for the custody battle. It wasn't just about the kids anymore. It was about his dignity, his future, and his right to be their father without Mark's shadow looming over him. The time had come to fight, and Brian was prepared to do whatever it took. The courtroom was a battleground. The tension in the air was palpable as Brian sat beside Karen, his lawyer, and tried to focus on the facts, but it was hard. His mind kept drifting back to Rachel and Mark. The images of Mark sitting there with that smug expression, the same expression he wore when he betrayed his best friend, when he took Brian's family apart. Brian's heart pounded as he sat there, the weight of everything building in his chest. His kids were there, sitting quietly in the corner, looking at their parents. They had no idea what was going on or what was at stake. The last thing they needed was to see their parents fight, but there was no way around it now. Rachel sat across from him with Mark, her eyes red from crying. She didn't look like the woman he had once loved. She looked broken, just like he felt. And yet, there was still that glimmer of hope in her eyes, the hope that somehow they could put it all back together. But Brian wasn't sure if that was even possible anymore. Karen leaned in and whispered, "Stay focused, Brian. Don't let them pull you into their drama. We've got this." But Brian wasn't so sure. As they began the proceedings, Mark's lawyer wasted no time. He painted a picture of Brian as a man who had failed his family, who had been too wrapped up in his career to be a present father. It was a story they had rehearsed, a story designed to paint Brian in the worst possible light. "Mr. Underwood," Mark's lawyer began, "has consistently put his job ahead of his children, neglecting them emotionally while pursuing his own ambitions. His failure to provide for his family, and his blatant disregard for his responsibilities makes him unfit to be their sole guardian. Brian's blood ran cold. The accusations hit hard, and for a moment he almost doubted himself. Was this what his life had become? A story of missed opportunities and broken promises? But then he remembered why he was here. He wasn't here to defend his past mistakes. He was here to fight for his kid's future. Objection! Karen's voice rang out, cutting through the tension in the room. These are baseless allegations designed to undermine my client's character. We're here to focus on what's best for the children, not on irrelevant personal matters. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, nodded and looked back at Brian. Mr. Underwood, do you have a response to these allegations? Brian took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His mind raced with words, but only one thing mattered: his kids. Everything he had done, every decision he had made was for them. He was a father first and foremost. He stood up, his heart pounding in his chest as he faced the judge and everyone in the room. Your Honor, I'll be the first to admit that I've made mistakes. I've been too focused on work. I've neglected my family, and I've hurt my wife. But no matter what mistakes I've made, there's one thing that's never been in question. I love my kids, and I'll do whatever it takes to be the father they deserve. I'll be here for them, every step of the way. His voice shook, but he wasn't afraid to speak the truth. He was done hiding behind the facade of a perfect family. His flaws were part of him, but they didn't define him. What defined him was his love for his children, and that was something Mark and everyone else in that room couldn't take away. The judge nodded, clearly impressed by Brian's sincerity. Thank you, Mr. Underwood. We'll take a short recess, and then we'll hear from the other side. Brian sat back down, his hands trembling slightly, but his resolve stronger than ever. He glanced over at Rachel, whose eyes were filled with guilt. She opened her mouth to speak, but Brian couldn't bear it. He wasn't here to listen to her anymore. He was here to protect his family. As they took a break, Brian stepped outside for a moment of air. The cool breeze hit his face, grounding him. He couldn't believe where he was, how far things had come. But he wasn't backing down now. Not for Rachel, not for Mark, but for his kids. Back inside, Mark's lawyer presented their case, painting Rachel as a loving mother who had only ever wanted what was best for her children. She was the one who had been there for them, the one who had always put them first. But Brian couldn't help but notice how Mark stood behind her, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder. It was a picture of false support, a lie designed to make it seem like he was the one who could give the kids what they needed. As they presented their case, the truth began to reveal itself. Karen had done her homework, and she was ready to strike. She called in witnesses, friends, and even neighbors who could vouch for Brian's commitment as a father. Slowly but surely, she dismantled Mark's case, piece by piece. But then came the moment Brian had been dreading. Rachel was called to the stand. She took a deep breath and looked over at Brian, her face pale. "I'm sorry," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. But she had made her choice. Now she had to face the consequences. "I've made mistakes," she began, her voice cracking. "But I love my children. I never wanted this to happen. I just wanted to feel loved again. I thought if I could make things work with Mark, everything would be okay." But it wasn't. Rachel's confession hit Brian like a ton of bricks. She was finally owning up to what she had done. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. She had already chosen Mark over him, over their family. And now there was no going back. The tension in the courtroom was thick as the judge processed everything. Brian's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. The moment that would define everything. But as the judge gave his final ruling, Brian felt something shift inside him. He had done everything he could. And no matter what happened next, he knew he had fought for what mattered most. Ready for the next chapter of the story? Let me know if you'd like to continue. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable. Brian had spoken his truth, but now he was about to see how the judge would decide, how the family he once dreamed of would be affected. The judge, an older man who had been through more than a few heated custody cases, looked back and forth between the two parents. Each side had presented their case, but at the end of the day, it all came down to one thing. Who could provide the most stable and loving home for the children? Brian couldn't keep his eyes off his kids, sitting there in the corner, their innocent faces lost in the mess of grown-up problems. His heart ached for them. They were too young to understand all this, too young to know the extent of the betrayal, the pain, the mess that had been created around them. And yet, in a way, they had witnessed it all. As the judge called for a short recess, Brian's mind raced. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the water bottle on the table, trying to steady his nerves. Was it enough? Had he done enough? Was his love for them enough to outweigh everything that had happened? He thought about Rachel, her tear-streaked face when she had confessed about the affair, about Mark. The weight of her words still lingered in his chest. How had everything turned so wrong? How had they reached this point? The pain of her betrayal felt like it had only gotten worse as time went on, not better. Brian turned to Karen, his lawyer, his trusted ally. Do you think it's enough? Do you think I've done enough to show that I can be the father they need? Karen, always the professional, gave him a reassuring smile. You've done what you can, Brian. You've been honest. You've fought for them. Now it's in the judge's hands. But even as she spoke, the uncertainty gnawed at him. He wasn't just fighting for custody. He was fighting for his right to be a father. His right to not be reduced to nothing more than the man who was betrayed by his wife. There was so much at stake here. As the court reconvened, the room seemed to grow even more tense. Rachel's eyes were red, her posture hunched in defeat. Mark sat beside her, trying to project calm, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Brian's blood boil. There was a smugness to his demeanor, as if he had already won. The judge cleared his throat and spoke. I've heard enough. It's clear that both parties love their children. But at the end of the day, the well-being of the children comes first. I'm going to grant joint custody with the children's primary residence with their father. Brian felt the words hit him like a ton of bricks. Joint custody. His children, his girls, would live with him. After everything, after all the heartache, he had won. The feeling of relief was overwhelming. He didn't just win custody, he had a chance to rebuild. A chance to show his daughters what it meant to have a father who cared. Rachel broke into tears beside Mark, her shoulders shaking as she wiped her eyes. She looked over at Brian, and for the first time in months, their eyes met. Not with anger or resentment, but with an unspoken understanding. They both knew that their marriage was beyond repair. But in this moment, they were still parents, still bound by the children they loved. Mark, on the other hand, seemed unaffected, his expression as unreadable as ever. Brian wasn't sure what he felt about the ruling, whether he was angry, disappointed, or simply trying to process it. All Brian knew was that he didn't need Mark's approval anymore. He didn't need to win him over. He had his kids. As the judge made the final call, the courtroom began to settle. There was a quiet weight to the air as the families gathered their things and prepared to leave. Brian stood up, feeling the strain in his legs after sitting for so long, but there was a lightness in his chest that hadn't been there in months. He glanced over at Karen, who gave him a small nod of approval. As they walked out of the courtroom, Brian's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Terry. You did it, man. How's it feel to win? The message read. Brian smiled to himself. Feels like I'm starting over, he texted back. Later that day, when Brian returned home, he felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes when you're alone. It felt both foreign and familiar at the same time. He looked around, taking in the rooms he would now be sharing with his daughters. The place didn't have the same warmth it once had, but it was his. He was going to make it work. He heard the sound of footsteps behind him and turned to see his girls standing in the doorway. Their eyes were wide, their faces full of questions. Daddy, are we going to live here now? The youngest one asked, her voice full of uncertainty. Brian's heart twisted. He kneeled down to their level and pulled them into a hug. Yes, sweetie. We're going to live here. Just us. It's going to be okay. He wanted to believe that. He wanted to believe that everything would be okay now that the fight was over. But he also knew that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. There would be days when the pain from the divorce would bubble to the surface, when the resentment would return. And there would be moments, perhaps even years from now, when his daughters would ask questions about their mother, about what happened between her and their father. Brian didn't have all the answers, but what he did have was his children, and that, he realized, was enough to keep him going. Later that evening, as he sat on the couch, watching his daughters play in the living room, the doorbell rang. It was a knock that seemed to freeze him in place. He stood up, his heart rate quickening, as he walked toward the door. When he opened it, there stood Rachel. Her face was tear-streaked, her posture defeated. "I didn't know where else to go," she said quietly. "Can we talk?" Brian stood there, his mind racing. What did she want? Did she really think that after everything they could just pick up where they left off? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped aside and gestured for her to come in. "Why now, Rachel?" he finally asked, his voice low but steady. "Why after everything?" She looked down at the floor, her shoulders sagging. "Because I realize what I lost, what I threw away, and I don't want to lose it all. I want to be here for the girls, for them, and for you too if you'll have me." Brian's heart ached as he watched her struggle with her words. He knew the pain she was feeling, but he also knew that it wasn't just about him. It was about their children. They needed to find a way to co-parent, to move forward with their lives, no matter how difficult that might be. "I don't know what to say, Rachel," he whispered. "I've been fighting for so long to keep us together, but now it's different. I'm not sure if I can go back to where we were, but we can try to figure this out. For the kids." Rachel nodded slowly, her eyes filling with tears once again. "I understand. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Brian. I just need you to know that I'm sorry. I never meant for things to get this far." As Brian stood there, looking at the woman who had once been his wife, he felt a strange sense of calm. He wasn't angry anymore. He didn't have the energy for it. The past was the past, and now it was time to focus on the future. With that, the story takes a deep breath, setting the stage for the final moments. There's still more to come, and the challenges ahead will test Brian, Rachel, and their family in ways they can't even imagine. But one thing is certain, this story is far from over. As the days passed, the weight of the decision Brian had made in the courtroom began to sink in. He was no longer just a man who had been betrayed. He was a father, a man rebuilding his life from the ground up. The victory of getting primary custody of his daughters didn't feel like a win. It felt like a new beginning, a second chance to become the father he always wanted to be. He took things day by day, making small changes in the way he approached fatherhood. The girls' laughter filled the house again, and it wasn't just a fleeting sound. It was a sign that they were healing too. They spent their afternoons in the park, or at the movies, or simply sitting around the kitchen table, talking. It was an adjustment, but one that Brian was committed to. He could already feel that he was becoming the man he wanted to be for them. Present, reliable, steady. And slowly, he was starting to believe that he could find peace within himself too. It wasn't just about the kids anymore. It was about him, his personal growth. Brian reflected on everything that had brought him here. The pain, the betrayal, the lies, and he realized that while he couldn't undo what had happened, he could control what came next. He had learned to let go of the anger that had once consumed him. He didn't need to keep carrying around the weight of Rachel's infidelity. What he needed was to move forward, to rebuild a life that was no longer defined by the mistakes of the past. And then Rachel reached out. It had been weeks since the divorce hearing. Brian hadn't heard from her except for the occasional text asking about the girls. But this time, the message was different. It wasn't about the children. It was about them. "I'm sorry, Brian. I think I made a huge mistake," the message read. Rachel had apologized several times before, but this felt different. This time, she wasn't just apologizing for the affair or the divorce. She was apologizing for everything. The years she had spent avoiding the truth, for the hurt she had caused him, for how she had broken their family. There was a rawness to her words that Brian hadn't expected. As much as he wanted to ignore it, as much as he knew he had to let go, part of him still longed for the woman he had once loved, the mother of his children. So he agreed to meet. They sat in a small cafe, the air between them filled with unspoken tension. Rachel looked different, more subdued. Her usual confidence had faded, replaced by a vulnerability that was almost unfamiliar to him. She hadn't worn the mask of the woman who once justified her actions. She was just Rachel now, the woman who had made mistakes and was trying to atone for them. "I've spent so much time hating myself for what I did," Rachel said quietly, stirring her coffee. "But I think the hardest part was realizing that I lost you. I can't take back what happened, but I want you to know that I'm not the same person I was when I made those choices." Brian listened, but the words didn't quite sink in. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, but the reality was that they were different people now. The love they had shared had been replaced by something else. Respect, maybe, or maybe just a weary acceptance of what was. But love? That was a distant memory. "I've been focused on the girls," Brian said after a pause. "And I think I'm finally in a place where I can start moving forward. Not just for them, but for me too. And I don't know if there's a place for us in that future. I don't know if we can fix things between us. But I don't want us to be stuck in the past either." Rachel nodded, her lips trembling as she fought back tears. "I know. I thought if I could make everything right again, we could somehow go back. But that's not possible, is it?" Brian shook his head. "No, it's not. We can't go back. All we can do is move forward." The silence between them wasn't heavy, but it wasn't comfortable either. They both understood the finality of the moment. They had both done things they couldn't take back. But they had both also grown. Brian finished his coffee, wiped his hands on his pants, and stood. "I think this is the part where we say goodbye for good." Rachel stood too, tears silently running down her cheeks. She reached out to hug him, and for a moment, Brian allowed it. It wasn't a goodbye with bitterness or regret. It was a goodbye that symbolized a new chapter, one where they would coexist as parents but no longer as partners. As Brian left the cafe, he felt a strange sense of peace. The finality of it all hadn't broken him. It had freed him, and he was ready for whatever came next. Back home, the girls were sitting at the kitchen table, their schoolwork spread out in front of them. They looked up as he entered the room, their faces lighting up with the sight of him. Brian smiled, knowing that no matter what happened in his personal life, he had them, and that was all that mattered. "Did you have a good day, Dad?" his oldest asked, her voice hopeful. "I did," he replied, sitting down with them. "How about you?" "Good," she chirped, showing him the colorful drawings she had made in class. He laughed softly, genuinely feeling at home in that moment. The chaos of the past months, the arguments, the betrayal, it all seemed so far away now. There was a lot of healing still to do, but in this quiet, peaceful house, with his girls by his side, he could finally begin to focus on the future. The rest of the night passed in a blur of homework, dinner, and bedtime routines. Brian tucked his daughters into bed, kissing them goodnight and promising that tomorrow would be another good day. As he stood in the doorway, watching their sleepy faces, he realized that he had what he needed. They were his future, and together they were going to build a new life. A few months later, Brian stood in front of his new home, his daughters by his side. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. He had worked hard to make this house a home, to create a place where they could all start over, a place where the past didn't have a hold on them. The road ahead wasn't easy. There would still be difficult moments, family holidays, awkward encounters with Rachel, and the occasional feeling of loneliness that came with being a single parent. But Brian had learned something valuable in the past year. Life doesn't always go as planned, but you can always find a way to move forward. He looked at his daughters, their faces full of wonder as they explored their new home. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of hope. This was a new beginning. If you've made it this far, thank you for following Brian's journey. Sometimes life throws us curveballs, but it's how we rise from them that defines who we are. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories like this. I appreciate your support, and I'll see you in the next video.